So we just wanted to start first and foremost with what you think are the most important aspects of FNMI that should be the focus in our schools today.
First Nation, Métis, and Inuit.
Correct.
In our schools here in Ontario.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, I think the most important thing for me that I like to see in the future is that Canadian children and youth, so the next generation, I've got 3 young boys, are able to tell a different kind of story about the past. And so what I mean by that is that I grew up learning certain narratives around what it meant to be a Canadian and how Canada was formed as a nation state. And I learned that in social studies in the primary junior school, and then I learned that in high school. And oftentimes the history that we learned in school was about European discoverers coming in and discovering a new land where there happened to be people that lived on it that were not educated, they weren't people of God, and therefore their land was for the taking because they weren't smart enough to manage their own land. And that's the story of colonization that I grew up with, and I had no knowledge of the Indian residential schooling system and its implementation and the intergenerational impacts until I went to do my graduate school at York University in education with Celia Higg-Brown, who had written an oral history book on the resiliency that survivors showed even despite the historical traumas that they experienced in the Indian residential schooling system. And when I did my master's thesis, I think that was like in 1999. I think just 2 years before that, the last school closed in Saskatchewan. So that's a history that, as a first-generation immigrant to Canada living in Northern Ontario, even though I went to school with First Nation students, even though we talked about Inuit people in a certain derogatory way in school, I had no clue about the historical impact of me being here. So I'd like to see schools start with that, to start at the very least, and I think to some extent in a small way they have by including it in official curriculum policy documents. So there's a movement to recognize, in light of Truth and Reconciliation, those different kinds of histories, and teachers of the future will have to figure out ways in which to be more inclusive of those narratives within their classroom. But I also think another thing that is a must-have in Ontario schools, and to think systemically about how we can do this, is that there needs to be the presence of qualified Indigenous elders or cultural workers or educational advisors in across the schooling system. And when I say qualified, it could be an elder that has a deep understanding of their historical roots, their cultural traditions, and the inequities that they've experienced. So that, to me, would be the next step, is to ensure that when we're envisioning various budgets for schooling systems, that's put in place. And so I think school boards and the Ontario Ministry of Education is looking to try to do that, and I'm hoping that at least in my lifetime that I'll be able to see that. Maybe not for my youngest son, who's 8 years old, but certainly for when the time comes and when they have their own kids, that it won't even be a question. It'll just be that's the way things are.